I believe Adam Booth has some type of qualification in sports psychology. And he's certainly somebody who takes a very keen interest in the psychology of fighters. And that's right up my street. That's something I talk about very often, is the psychology of fighters. So that's always been one of Booth's strong points, in my opinion, is his understanding of the psyche of fighters, the psychology of boxing. That's always been one of his strong points, in my opinion. And another one of his strong points is an understanding of the physiology of fighters. And this particular interview right here with Adam Booth is one of the best interviews that I've ever seen of his, because he has asked questions about strength and conditioning and, various other aspects of boxing. And he gives the kind of answers which you won't be accustomed to hearing. So I highly recommend this particular interview right here. It's on Seconds Out YouTube channel. Very, very good interview. The interviewer asks him very good questions, and Adam Booth gives some very, very detailed and interesting answers. And apart from the psychology, which I'm interested in, another aspect of boxing in the modern age, which I'm not entirely convinced by, is the whole strength and conditioning aspect. Because you get a lot of fighters now who hire a separate strength and conditioner to train them. Okay, so they've got their main trainer who just teaches them boxing. Then they've got their strength and conditioning coach. And sometimes they'll have a third person who's their nutritionist. Occasionally, the strength and conditioning guy will also double up as a nutritionist. I think that's the case, for example, with Ruben Tabarez, when he was David Hayes' strength and conditioning coach. And I think Ruben Tabarez also worked with Amir Khan. So, yeah, Adam Booth is asked about these things. And Booth says that in his experience, a lot of the stuff that strength and conditioning coaches do might be great for sprinting and might be great for getting ripped or cutting weight or whatever the case may be. But a lot of it is actually detrimental for boxing. And this is something I've felt for a very long time, just intuitively. And being around boxing as long as I have, which is most of my life, boxing myself, knowing many boxers, being in gyms for, decades and decades, making observations and what have you, coming up with my own philosophy about boxing. For me, the proof is in the pudding. And for me, replicating what takes place in a boxing ring is what you should be trying to do with all aspects of training. That's what you should be trying to do. And you should also understand what kind of fighter you have and what their attributes are. But for example, I remember being in a gym years ago, in an amateur gym, and they had a guy in there, an old guy who clearly had some type of background in strength and conditioning. And he was an advocate for sprinting and not doing long distance running. He did not believe in fighters doing long distance running. He said, you need to be doing sprints. Don't do long distance runs. Long distance runs will mess up your knees in the long run, and they won't really benefit you that much in terms of when you're in the ring. And I think it really does depend on what kind of fighter you are, what your body's like, what your metabolism is like. But for me, for example, in my early days, as an amateur boxer, I was doing the long runs. And from when I was in school, from when I was a little kid, I was never a long distance runner. I was always a sprinter. I was always somebody who excelled at sprinting. When it came to long distance running, I found it difficult and I found it boring. And so in my early days as an amateur, I was doing all these long runs and all this kind of stuff. And it was actually doing more harm than good. I was getting shin splints because, I'm a relatively big guy. I mean, not a big heavyweight by today's standards at all, but still a heavyweight. And I would get shin splints and all kind of problems with my knees and what have you because of the weight I was carrying. And, even when I would lose weight, it would alleviate the shin splints a little bit, but I'd still get them, particularly when I do long runs. And I didn't really feel that much benefit in terms of stamina, not the kind of benefit you'd expect from doing all that running. Later on, much later on, when I was, well into my 20s, I started doing sprints instead and doing no long runs at all. And I found I gained a massive, massive improvement in my performance in the gym doing boxing activities, whether I was on the pads, sparring, etc. I just had a massive improvement, so I realized that sprints were the way for me and that it was pretty much useless me doing long distance runs because it really was of no benefit to me at all. But that's my particular body type. That's my particular metabolism. I was always someone with a lot, a high proportion of fast twitch muscle in my body. So I was always one of those fighters who would fight in sharp, fast, explosive bursts, but wouldn't necessarily fight consistently and steadily through the course of a round. I'd fight in bursts, like a David Haye fights in bursts, or a Mike Tyson fights in bursts, or, a George Groves or a Roy Jones Jr. These are not guys who tend to fight 3 minutes of a round, particularly with the likes of Roy Jones and people like that, David Haye. So that was the kind of, obviously I was not on their level, but in a general sense, that's the kind of body that I had, was a body that responded well to sprint training because that's the way my body was wired, for that kind of movement, for fast, explosive movement. That's why I was good at sprinting as a kid and whatnot. And so I've spoken many times about the fact that there is no one size fits all method to training fighters. And I think a lot of these strength and conditioning coaches, they come to the table thinking that there's actually a one size fits all method to training a fighter when it comes to strength and conditioning. Some boxing coaches think there's a one size fits all method to training fighters in terms of the technique. And as I say, strength and conditioning coaches, a similar situation with in their discipline. What you need to do is have an understanding of boxing. This is why Adam Booth in this interview says that when a fighter has a strength and conditioning coach, Adam Booth is watching what the coach is doing like a hawk. He wants to know every single thing the strength and conditioning coach is getting his fighter to do. And if he don't like certain things, he says, no, I don't like this, and I don't like that, and I don't like the other. Because Booth has learned over time that boxing is a sport that requires very specific types of training. Very specific, And like I said, my whole thing is to try and replicate as closely as possible what happens in the ring with every aspect of training. So the sprinting gets your heart rate up very fast. And that gives you the ability to change gears in the boxing ring, to switch up the pace. Quick injections of speed and movement. This is what the sprinting helps you to do in the ring. And the heavy bag, I saw an interview with an American boxing coach recently where he said fighters don't hit the heavy bag enough these days. And when they do hit the heavy bag, they're just tapping it. They're not really laying into it like the old school fighters did in the past. And this is something I definitely agree with, because again, it's easy for me to sit here and tell you that I was this, that, and the other as an amateur when I don't have the, Olympic gold medal and credentials to show for it. But, for whatever it's worth, I always was a tremendous puncher. Okay. It was something that I focused on from very early on when I first started boxing. I used to watch people like Tyson, Tommy Hearns, and break down what they were doing from a mechanical point of view, how they were generating this power, and I would copy obsessively. And this was going on for years and years and years and years and years. And so I was somebody who used to spend a hell of a lot of time on the bag. And I would try and find the biggest heavy bags available in whatever gym I had to go to and try and move these enormous bags, but maintain correct technique, not be pulling punches back from, 5 miles away and then hitting the bag so it moves. No, maintaining my punches as short and making sure there was no tell on them, but really concentrating on building up punching power. And these days, you just don't see so many fighters doing it anymore. You watch a lot of these fighters, these professional fighters on the bag, and they're just tapping the bag. You don't see him hitting the bag like George Foreman used to hit the bag or Mike Tyson used to hit the bag. And this is having a negative impact on people when it comes to punching power. It is. You develop and improve your punching power through using the heavy bag the correct way, which means focusing on improving power and improving technique. This is something which, if you're hitting the bag hard as a mofo, then it's going to be relatively easy to transfer that into the ring. Now, there are drawbacks to doing too much heavy bag work, definitely. Maybe I'll talk about that in a different video. But again, that's something which helps to improve punching power more so than hitting the pads, because hitting the pads don't offer as much resistance as hitting the bag. A bag is a much heavier object, you see? So that's something where fighters should be, in my opinion, concentrating on more, is on hitting the heavy bag and focusing on power punching on the heavy bag. Not going for a million punches around. No, going for quality, not quantity on the bag in a lot of sessions. Focusing on power shots and developing power. And there are many other aspects to training where, like I say, you need to try and replicate what happens in the ring more. I mean, even pads themselves, right? I've never been a fan of pads personally. I'm not saying they don't have their place. I'm not saying they're not useful. They are useful. But when I used to train, I was never, when I used to box, I was never a fan of them. So you're hitting two different targets when you're hitting the pads. When you get in the ring to fight, you're not hitting a two-headed man. You're hitting a man with one head. Do you understand where I'm going with this? So how accurate is hitting the pads? I know you say, oh, well, hitting the pads gets you to punch through the target. I really don't think it does. I think the punch shield that you see Golovkin using a lot these days is more effective and I think more realistic a target than pads. Some of you may not know what I mean by the punch shield, but just type it into YouTube, Golovkin punch shield, and there are many other fighters who use it. I think the punch shield is a more accurate target to be hitting, to try and replicate what goes on in a boxing ring. And there are certain pieces of boxing equipment which to me are just for show. They're really obsolete and they don't really offer much benefit using them. And one of them would definitely be the speed bag, or some people call it the speed ball. It's just something which looks pretty for the cameras, but I don't see how that's going to benefit you in any way in a boxing ring. I was someone who hardly ever used it. I never felt any benefit from using it or anything. So never been an advocate for using the speed ball. And if you look at a lot of great fighters over the years, there are many great fighters who never use a speed ball. In fact, there are many great fighters who never use pads. I've spoken before about how Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. never, ever hit the pads prior to Manny Stewart training him. Manny Stewart took him on the pads and Chavez Sr. said, I've never used pads before. And this was when he had about, 80, 90, 100 fights or whatever it was. Was this after he lost to Frankie Randall? When he was with Manny Stewart? It must have been after he was with after he lost to Frankie Randall. So he must have been in the 90s in terms of the amount of fights he'd had. And he'd never used pads before. But yet look at all the success he'd had without using pads. Or mitts, as some people call them. Some fighters get to thinking that some of these pieces of training equipment are essential, but they're actually not. Necessarily anyway. not necessarily essential. Different strokes for different folks, So, yeah, anyway, have a watch of this interview. Very, very interesting stuff from Adam Booth. Briefly talks about the psychology of fighters, what fighters need mentally and emotionally going into a fight, and also the strength and conditioning aspect, whereby a lot of stuff that strength and conditioning coaches do is actually detrimental to fighters. It doesn't benefit them, Anyway, yeah, let me know how you feel in the comment section below. Give this interview a watch, all right? It's happening, I'm out.